everyone. Welcome to the very last lecture. It's one of my favorite lectures. I know I've said that so many times, but I really like reproduction because, it's life. We're talking about making life here. And in fact, let's take a minute to look at my cute little baby boy. Oh, it's so cute. I know, I think that because I'm his mother, but yes. Okay, let's get started. So today we are going to talk about reproductive system. This little lecture piece is going to be about the female reproductive system, and then I'll do a separate one for the male reproductive system. Before we get into it, let's get at the heart of the matter and talk about gonads. Gonads are the glands that create the gametes, and a gamete is just an egg for female or sperm for male. Those are the gametes, the sex cells. So for females, we have the ovaries. The ovaries produce the eggs. And then for male, the gonad would be the testes, and the testes produce the sperm. These are also mixed glands, which just means that they are both endocrine glands and exocrine glands. Their exocrine product would be those gametes. Their endocrine product, that means that it produces hormones, because endocrine glands produce hormones. And so the endocrine product would be the sex hormones. So like testosterone or estrogens, they are also produced from the gametes. Okay, and then the rest of the whole structure is just for delivering those gametes or housing the fetus. So really the core of the matter would be those gonads there. Okay, so starting with the female reproductive system first, then we'll do the male second. For the female reproductive system, I'm going to start with a broad overview first, and then we'll get into the individual structures in just a second. So here are the gonads. Again, here's the ovary that's producing the gametes, as well as the sex hormones, specifically estrogens and progesterone. Then we have the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes. If you learned that term, that's how I learned it growing up. But we're going to call them uterine tubes in this class. Then we have the uterus here. The uterus is what houses it, also known as the womb. And then down here would be the vagina. Okay, so we have the ovary, uterine tubes, uterus, and vagina. So we're going to get into and talk about each one specifically, individually, starting with the ovaries. Inside the ovaries, that is where you're going to house the stem cells that will eventually become the eggs, also known as oocytes. And so the interesting thing about females, and this is different for males, for females, upon birth, you have all of the primary oocytes, all of those eggs that you're ever going to have. After you're born, that's all the eggs that you're going to have, and then you just release one every month. So here are all the eggs. Those are called primary oocytes, the immature ones, and those eggs, the oocytes, they mature inside of these circular structures that are called follicles. A follicle. So the follicle just refers to that collection of cells that houses and surrounds and supports the developing oocyte inside. So if you're looking at the ovary, here's the ovary. This is a primary follicle, just meaning very early stages, not well developed yet. As it develops, it develops inside of those follicles, and it grows a space called an antrum, and so that the oocyte gets pushed off to the side, and as it matures, it gets bigger and bigger and pushes off to the side, and so that when it's ready, it will be ovulated. So ovulation just means that the egg, the oocyte, is spit out of the uterus. It just ruptures open. It's actually kind of traumatic a little bit. So the follicle ruptures open, and then the egg or the oocyte is spit outward, and it has to be, we'll talk about how it gets into the uterine tubes in just a second. And so we have this egg just sort of floating out, and then what's left, so the remains of the follicle, Okay, so after the oocyte has left, the remains of the follicle become a different sort of a little bit like scar tissue. That's what it kind of looks like. That's going to be called the corpus luteum, and the corpus luteum has a different role because it produces different hormones. It produces progesterone, and it just sort of kind of degrades away. Okay, so we have the oocyte inside of a follicle. Once the oocyte leaves, the follicle is turned into a corpus luteum. And all of this happens under the kind of control of the anterior pituitary. It produces a hormone called the follicle stimulating hormone. You'll learn more about that if you get into physiology. Okay, so at this point, we have our eggs ruptured and spit out from those ovaries. Now we need to make our way into the uterus. And so to get there, we need to go through the uterine tube. Okay, so here is the uterine tube here. At the very ends of the uterine tube, you have these little finger-like projections. Those are called fimbriae. Okay, so fimbriae. And those fimbriae, they kind of wave like this, and they create the current that kind of helps capture and draw that oocyte as it's spit out of the ovary into the uterine tube. From the uterine tube, it's got to make its way down through the uterine tube all the way into the uterus. And to do that, it has these little projections on the top of its cells that beat. They create currents when they move all together. What are those called? Okay, so not microvilli, the other projections are called cilia. Okay, so those little cilia, they all move in their own, all together, and they create this current that draws the oocyte towards the uterus. So this is usually the site of fertilization, which just means the penetration by the sperm. Okay, so that's going to happen around in the uterine tubes, usually. Okay, so let's look at some other structures of the uterine tubes. Again, the finger-like projections at the ends of the uterine tubes, those are called fimbriae. The very initial segment that creates sort of like a funnel shape. So this very large, in large part right here, this funnel shaped part of the uterine tube, that's called the infundibulum. Infundibulum. You may have remember that infundibulum, there's also an infundibulum that connects the pituitary gland to the brain. It's the same kind of thing. So this is the infundibulum. Okay, that's the first initial expanded part, the funnel shaped part. And then we have the ampulla, and the ampulla is the enlarged region. Then we have the isthmus. So the TH part of that is usually pronounced silently. So isthmus. So let me just show you a little bit more kind of help with those two terms. An ampulla, this actually is a kind of broad term that just means the rounded enlarged part of a canal or tube. Okay, so for example, you see an ampulla, it's like a Roman flask. See how it's kind of narrow, and then kind of fat in the middle. And we've already seen this when we talked about inside of the ear. We talked about the structures for equilibrium. So here's the semicircular canals, the skinny part, and then there's a large fat part at the end. That's the ampulla. And remember, the crista ampullaris was inside of there. So you have seen this term before. Just means the enlarged part of a tube. It's ampulla. In this example here, this would be there's the gallbladder, this is the common bile duct, there's another ampulla there. So I just put those in there to remind you that you have seen these terms before. An ampulla is just an enlarged part of a tube. Now, isthmus is the opposite of that. The isthmus is a narrowing part between two larger structures. And to kind of visualize that, I got the Isthmus of Panama here. So here's the Isthmus of Panama. See this narrow region right in here. You got fatter parts on the ends. The narrowing part would be the isthmus. So again, we have the fimbriae, finger-like projections that draw the egg inside. Infundibulum, the very, very initial part where it's funnel shaped in there. The ampulla is the fat part, the narrowing region before it connects to the uterus is called the isthmus. Okay, so on to the uterus. here is the uterus. The uterus has several different regions, kind of connected, and remember the stomach, right? Same kind of idea. So we've even seen this word before, fundus, fundus. Okay, so think back to the stomach. Where was the stomach? Where was the fundus on the stomach, right? So it's that initial rounded pouch-like structure at the top. Okay, so here, this expanded rounded area at the top, that's the fundus. This middle part in the middle, that's the body. And then this part right here, there's a new word we haven't seen, that's the cervix. So the cervix is the neck, the narrow opening of the uterus, right? Like cervical, okay? So kind of step back and look at it. So you have the enlarged part here, the narrow opening kind of going into the uterus, that is the cervix. Here is the cervix, the neck of the uterus. And then here's the vagina here. And the vagina, so we have the cervix at the end of it. The vagina is a muscular walls, and that is going to be for the birth canal as well as for sex, right? That's where the vagina is. Okay. So let's talk a little bit of some pathology here, and I want to just mention some ectopic pregnancy. So ectopic pregnancy means that instead of implanting in the body of the uterus, instead of that, it implants someplace that it's not supposed to be. Okay, so really think about it. So you have here's your ovary here, and it's going to be ovulated, which again just means spitting it out and hoping for the best. Occasionally, it's not captured properly by those fimbriae, and so it can embed itself into tissues just in the abdominal pelvic cavity, or sometimes on the outside of the uterine tube instead of on the inside, or sometimes, and this is probably the most often, sometimes it embeds itself in that isthmus. And remember, isthmus, narrow, right? Once it starts growing, there's no place for it to be. So this can be a life-threatening problem because it can burst open that uterine tube. And this actually happened to my sister-in-law, and she had to go rush to the hospital, and it was really scary. She lost that entire uterine tube. So she, whole half of her reproductive system gone. But, she survived, and actually she got pregnant again, and her baby's now a year old. So it's not, it wasn't the worst thing ever, but, it was pretty scary. Okay, so again, ectopic pregnancy just means that it embeds in not the right place, right? It's supposed to be nice here in the body so that it can have a good place to grow. Okay. So this is my PSA for the day, public service announcement. Go get your pap smears, ladies. So you should be getting one every year. And what they do in a pap smear is they take this little machine and that just sort of spreads the vagina open a little bit so that they can get inside. And then at the end of it, they have this little brush, and all they do is they just swirl the brush along the cervix, and that just gently scrapes off some cells. And then they take those cells and they just look at them under the microscope. They look at them to see if they have the right shape, or you see whether or not they have too many nuclei. So it should be just one nucleus per cell. If it's got more than that, that indicates that it might be cancerous. So they're looking for cervical cancer. Also, they can test for HPV, which is the human papillomavirus. And one thing that's interesting and kind of disturbing about that is that the human papillomavirus, it can actually cause cancer, right? So we really definitely want to get this done pretty regularly so that, you want to screen early, catch things early so you can fix it early. Okay, that's this pap smear. So what was that cervix, right? Do you remember that word, cervix? It's like cervical, right? It's the narrow, narrow neck-like opening of the uterus. Okay, sorry. So for the uterus, let's look at some of the layers. Okay, so as you imagine, a large part of the uterus has a muscular wall. That would be the myometrium. That's the middle layer. Inside of that, we have the endometrium. So remember, endo means inside, myo means muscle, and then around the outside, we have perimetrium. Remember, peri means around, like perimeter. So we have the endometrium. And so when you're looking at this right here, this is just a cross section under the microscope. So here, so you can see the smooth muscle, that would be the myometrium. The perimetrium is just the serous membrane surrounding the outside, sort of like how the serosa was just on the outside of the intestines, the same idea. So this would be the visceral peritoneum surrounding there. And then looking at the endometrium, see all of the structures here? You got a lot of good stuff there. You've got glands, you've got a lot of blood vessels there. And so when the fetus, I should say, when the fetus, or I should say embryo, actually, embryo implants itself into the endometrium, all of those, that good blood supply, some glands in there, just like a nice comfy home for that little embryo to embed itself into the endometrium right in there. Helps nourish it, protect it, and, you know, feed it, give it life, right? Okay, and so if you are not pregnant though, that endometrium that was grown up gets shed, right? So the endometrium gets thicker and thicker and thicker as you progress through the cycle. If there's no pregnancy happens because when the corpus luteum is gone, what happens is you no longer have the progesterone, and so that endometrium just sort of sheds away, just sort of deteriorates, and you even have the myometrium doing the little spasm contractions. That's why we get cramps, and that whole thing comes out. Okay, so during menstruation or menses, if you call it like that, that's the endometrium would be the part that gets shed for that. Okay, I think I covered everything on that. So let's just check it out. So what I want you to do now is pause the video, see if you can answer these questions, see if you can write them down even, and then I'll go over it. Okay, welcome back, hopefully. So which layer does what? So which layer is the site for implantation? So again, that means that the embryo is nestling down into which one? That would be the endometrium, endo meaning inside. Which one contracts to expel fetus during labor? Now, when you see the word contract, the ones that do contract is muscle, right? So that would be the smooth muscle layer of the uterus, and so that has to be myometrium. Remember, myo means muscle. Myo means muscle, so the myometrium is the one that's going to contract. So you do it for labor, but it also does little contractions during menstruation as well. So which one is going to be shed during menstruation? Okay, so which one has those glands and the large blood supply? That would be the endometrium, which is a serous membrane so that would have to be on the outside, right? Because the serous membranes line the outside of the organs. And so that would be the perimetrium, which one is composed of smooth muscle, myometrium. There you go. Okay, so last little piece, let's talk about some of the external reproductive system structures. For females, the entire external reproductive structure collectively is called the vulva. The vulva is the whole thing. And what we're looking at is this would be the front, so anterior to posterior. At the very front, we have a little kind of mound of fat. This would sit right near that pubic symphysis part where the bones come together. That would be called the mons pubis. This is the part that usually grows pubic hair, unless you shave it off, of course. And then coming down kind of towards the posterior, then we have the clitoris. Now for the clitoris is the homologous structure to the penis. For females, that's going to have the, what's the word? It's got caverns that fill with blood. Erectile tissue. So sorry. So the clitoris has those erectile tissues in it, and those erectile tissues are what's going to cause it to grow and swell, and it's got a lot of, nerve endings in there. So that's the clitoris there. And then we have two folds of skin, I should say. The outer one, the bigger one, is called the labia majora like bigger. And then we have the labia minora like smaller. And then inside we have two openings. We have the urethral opening, that is where the pee comes out, and then we have the vagina posterior to that. And I really like to highlight this because this is different for males and females. For males, there's only one opening. For females, there are two. And also, other animals also only have one. So for example, like cats, they have what's called a urogenital sinus, which just means the vagina and the urethra kind of combine together before making one single opening. But for humans, there's two. Okay, so we can look at it from the side as well. So this is the sagittal section through here. So from the beginning, this would be the mons pubis. There's the clitoris. There's the labia minora and majora, so mike's bigger and smaller. The two openings, we have the urethra opening first, and then we have the vaginal opening second, okay, posterior to that, and then there's the anus in the back. So I do like to point out, because this is a common source of error for lab practicals, notice that the smaller one with the thinner wall underneath it, this is the bladder. This is the urinary bladder. And then sitting on top of it is the uterus. That's the word. Uterus here sitting on top. And that's why when you're pregnant, you have to go pee all the time, because as this gets bigger and bigger, it's like literally just sitting right on top of that urinary bladder. Okay, so the thinner wall below it is the urinary bladder. The one with a nice thick wall on top, that would be the uterus. There's the cervix right there, ovary, uterine tube right there. Okay, that's it. See you later.